happy to introduce Amy Whitaker, who will talk to us about the Reimagine theme that we have as part of our final day of the Arts and Cultural Management Conference. This is the 4th annual conference, and we are very happy that you are here with us today and that maybe you've been with us since the beginning on Thursday. And please do try to still get in touch with each other, connect and share ideas even after the conference. You can use the handles of social media that we've shared earlier somewhere in the chat. So yeah, we are always happy to keep in touch even after the conference. But now we'll just give the floor to our final keynote speaker, who is tuning in from the US. And we're very excited to have you and your presentation here. So I won't spare any more minutes. I'll just give the floor to you. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I want to offer thanks to the whole team, Andrea, Kelsey, Luca, Nicole, Shari, Lynn, Augustina, Kimalea, and the rest of the volunteers at ACM and NCAT. I'm extremely honored to join you. And what an incredible set of talks and programs to be part of. My theme for today on the day of Reimagine is the idea of inventing point B, and specifically reimagining collaboration and restitution using blockchain technologies. So what I'll do is talk a little bit at first about what I mean by inventing point B, and then use the example of restitution of cultural objects using blockchain as an example of that. The way that my computer is set up, I'm not able to see the chat while I'm presenting. So Andrea or Luca, if they're pressing questions, feel free to just jump in, and I'll also aim to save some time at the end. But I want to thank you all for being here. It's really my honor to be with you, and I hope that this talk is an invitation to a kind of reimagination and grounding as we are all kind of colleagues together in kind of a cultural and artistic work in the world. I am an assistant professor of visual arts administration at NYU, and some of these ideas relate to books I've been fortunate to write, notably a 2016 book called Art Thinking, and a book that comes out later this year called Economics of Visual Art. So I want to start with a question that has always really moved me. And it's a question that a writer friend of mine, his editor asks him this question when he's deciding what to write about. And this is the question: what is stunning and amazing? Like, what is stunning and amazing? So just take a minute to think about what pops into your mind in your life. I'm looking out at very bright sun-reflected snow. But I think, you know, for me, when I ask that question, what is stunning and amazing, this past year, even though we've all been mainly inside, has given so many opportunities to think about that. I find it stunning and amazing that this gentleman knows how to DJ his stove so expertly. I also find it stunning and amazing that Rachel Syme, who writes for The New Yorker, used a gift exchange software program called Elfster, Secret Santa software, to organize an international pen pal exchange where there are 10,000 people who write each other letters all over the world. And it's fun if you check out her Twitter feed. She shows photos of some of the things that people send each other, this kind of generosity. I think at the same time, you know, in a more sorrowful sense, it's stunning and amazing to even begin to not even calculate, but comprehend the scale of grief and loss and change in the last year. People who've lost family members, medical workers who've been on the front line, food insecurity, stress, change, just the sort of change in our collective lives. I also think it's stunning and amazing what we've seen in medical progress in the last year. This is Dr. Kizzmekia, goes by Kizzy Corbett, who works at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease in the United States, the organization that Dr. Fauci heads. And she's the person who had an enormous role in mapping the coronavirus spike protein, which is necessary for the design of the messenger RNA vaccines, so the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. in the United States. And I just think it's sort of incredible, her joy at receiving information that allows her to do this work. And how incredible, how stunning and amazing the speed and humanity of scientific work in the last year. So one of the things that really comes up for me when I think about this is, and when I think about the pandemic in particular, from the lens that I think we all share of coming from the arts and kind of cultural management, is this idea not only of artistic creativity, but of what it is to be analytic and creative at the same time. So if you think back to March or so, there are conversations, what's the big deal about March of last year? What's the big deal about coronavirus? Only so and such number of people have died. And to me, this is, among other things, a kind of failure of imagination, or of imagination and analytic thinking at the same time. It's like saying, look, I see the car is going 5 miles an hour. That's demonstrably factually true. What could possibly go wrong? And then expanding the viewfinder to see that the car is going 5 miles an hour downhill, accelerating toward a cliff. And so to me, this is part of what art and cultural management may have to offer the world, among many other things. But it's also the difficulty in a time that's so characterized by quantitative analysis, quantified financial markets, ways of understanding the world based on the past. These are questions, artistic questions of understanding the world based on doing the labor of imagining the future. And to me, this is best described in what I call inventing point B. So I borrow this a little bit, or adapt it, from the work of the philosopher Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger wrote an essay in 1947, The Origin of the Work of Art. I've assigned it to students. It's not easy to read, even though the words are all recognizable in and of themselves. But there's a passage in it where Heidegger writes, whenever art happens, that is, whenever there is a beginning, a thrust enters history, history either begins or starts over again. So when I think about that, I think you could say that what Heidegger means is that if you're making a work of art, and that could literally be a work of art, or if you're engaged in art as a process in any area of life, you're not going from a known point A to a known point B. You are inventing point B. The work of art changes the world to make space for itself. So you are investing time and resources in a point A world, but you don't know the value, or even that you might succeed until the point B world that your work creates. So I want to go through a couple of different examples, really stories of what I mean by this. I'm going to start outside the arts and then move to the arts. So I brought 3 examples. The first is the British runner, Roger Bannister. In 1952, Roger Bannister, Dr. Bannister, or Sir Roger Bannister by title, he was running in the Olympics in Helsinki, and he came in 4th. He did not medal. He was quite devastated, but he said to himself, I'm going to keep running for 2 more years. He was training to be a doctor. He spent his career as a neurologist, and he said, if I can't figure out how to, succeed as a runner in the next 2 years, I'm going to give up. So this picture is July 1952. May 1954, so almost a full 2 years later. This is Bannister, and he is at Iffley Road Track in Oxford, and this is the moment where he is the first person in modern recorded sporting history to run a mile in under 4 minutes. This may not seem so remarkable right now. The world record in a mile is roughly 3 minutes and 46 seconds. But at the time, people thought this was humanly impossible. The world record in the mile had stood at about 4 minutes and 1.4 seconds for a decade. And not only did people think it was impossible, they thought that he might die trying. Bannister and two other athletes, one American and one Australian, were competing to try to break the 4-minute barrier, and newspapers of record had obituaries pre-written just in case. I find this story moving. I've seen this video many times, and it's a great 5-minute break if you're ever working and you just need a change. It's hard to describe the extent to which this was an ordinary day. Bannister had slipped and fallen on a hospital floor the day before because it was newly polished. The weather had been so bad, even by British standards, that they almost had to cancel the attempt. When they started running, one of the other runners made a false start, so they had to start over again. And the bad weather itself was very risky because the sort of elegance of the effort here is to give full energy, none of it wasted. So if you have to run into the wind, even on one side of the track, it really deadens your ability to do this. What you probably notice already is that Bannister is not doing this alone, although he is credited for the accomplishment, as if a single artist who has many people working alongside. Bannister here is working with two of his friends, and they train together and they're running together. This is Chris Brasher and Chris Chataway. Brasher, who's out in front in this picture, goes on to co-found the London Marathon. And Chataway, who's in the back, is definitely no slouch. He's a world record holder in the 3-mile distance. And what you'll see is that they're pacing him so that he doesn't go out too fast. I've skipped ahead. You start to see Bannister passing Chataway so that he runs the last lap on his own. And this to me is sort of extraordinary as a picture of human effort, because what Bannister is doing that I think we are called to do so rarely in our lives is he's giving it absolutely everything he has before he knows whether he will succeed or not. And I can't think when I've been asked to do that. So here he is, he's coming in to finish. And as he finishes, he essentially blacks out, doesn't know what's happened. But in fact, he has done it. His friends who are announcing the race, these twins who actually go on to co-found the Guinness Book of World Records, announce the race time starting with a 3. And they overnight become these kind of international sporting sensations. They meet Winston Churchill, even my mother, who was growing up in Arkansas and may have had a killer tennis serve that did not follow international running at all. Remembered this happening. And here's what I think is so curious about it from the standpoint of inventing point B. So in the point A world, they tried to do this and people believed it was impossible. And then somehow on an ordinary day, they crossed over this threshold and proved that it was possible. And then Bannister only held the record for 45 days because once people saw it was possible, they incrementally improved on it. I had the extreme good fortune to meet Dr. Bannister before he passed away a couple of years ago. And I think he's also just a gracious human being or was, but he said that he related to this idea of art. He always maintained that his greatest contributions in life were to neurology and to his family. And he also suffered a car accident in the 1970s, which broke his ankle in such a way he wasn't able to run in some of the later chapters of his life. But I think that this is just a sort of story of invention, a story of imagining something as possible and then doing it. And I think that art really asks this of us. Art asks to be renewed and reinvented all the time. So to take an example from the arts, I think we may all sort of have an awareness of the Tate Modern in London. I was extremely fortunate to work there in the summer of 2000. I did not go to the opening party. I arrived about a week and a half later. But this to me is an act of inventing point B. This is something that was imagined and created and that changed the world around itself. Nicholas Sirota, the director, was sort of, I mean, I guess famous in a number of general ways, but also sort of legendary in the organization and in the arts for the way in which he got the job at the Tate in 1988. And the way he did that was he was not the front runner candidate. He had run Modern Art Oxford and he had run the Whitechapel Gallery, but he was one of 3 candidates and not the most likely. And they were all asked to write a strategic plan for the Tate. And his was limited to 2 sides of a piece of A4 paper titled Grasping the Nettle. And apparently everything he wrote on that paper, he accomplished in the first several years of the job. But the thing that always sticks with me, which is what he wrote at the end, was that the Tate is loved, but not sufficiently respected. Artists continue to regard it with ambivalence, though their support is the key for an institution which should safeguard the future by attention to the present. A gallery cherished by artists will eventually be appreciated by all. So this is what he's thinking about in 1988. And in 1991, so this is 7 or 8 years before the Tate even acquired Bankside, the power station site physically. These are concept drawings for Tate Modern. This is actually Sirota's own hand written on documents that are in the Tate archives, which I reproduce with gratitude to them, both here and in the forthcoming Economics of Visual Art. But this to me is this idea of inventing point B, of holding space to imagine the future before it becomes demonstrated. And there are countless examples where you see this happen, and you often see it happen in the context of people's whole lives. So just to give one more example before I kind of move into a broader view of the topic. This is a man named Thomas Fogarty. I realize this is a little doctor-centric. My examples, I think the pandemic has put me on especially on a healthcare channel of thought. Fogarty is a cardiovascular surgeon. He is the inventor of non-invasive cardiovascular surgery. He grew up as what he called a sort of self-professed juvenile delinquent in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was constantly getting into trouble. For example, when his teacher was not looking, he would jump out of the window at school to go fly fishing, and then they'd have to find his mother, who's a single parent working sort of job, a very difficult job at a dry cleaner, and they'd have to get her and she'd have to come get him. So everybody agreed that he needed to be either supervised or busy. So they got him a part-time job. He went to work in a hospital, and the only reason he went to work in a hospital is that hospitals were at the time exempt from child labor laws, and he was only 13. So he worked for a man named Dr. Jack Cranley, who had 10 children and considered Fogarty the 11th. And this is a little gruesome, so a bit of a trigger warning. What Cranley did was remove blood clots. And at the time, there was a prevailing kind of orthodoxy or belief in medicine that the bigger the incision, the better the surgeon. So they would open up the length of an artery to remove a clot. Many people died. Many people came back for secondary operations that involved amputations. And Fogarty said there has to be a better way. And so he reimagined it very differently. He said, you know, what if you made a very small incision and you inserted a piece of catheter, urethral catheter, with the pinky finger of a number 5 latex glove, and you could move this tube past the clot, expand the balloon with a sterile saline solution, and then pull the clot back out. So this procedure has now, gone on to save an estimated 20 million lives. But at the time, it was almost impossible for them to do. Cranley used this in surgical procedures courageously, but no one would manufacture it and no one would publish it. Finally, it was manufactured. Sometimes I think people who are at the very top of their field can be the most kind of gracious and expansive and seeing unfamiliar new ideas. And in this case, Dr. Al Starr, who had become famous in the United States and probably more globally for conducting the first heart valve transplant around 1960, Fogarty approached him, and he went to his business partner, Lowell Edwards, who was a hydraulics engineer, and said, listen, I feel sorry for this kid. We need to manufacture this. And they literally copied Dr. Starr's contract, giving Fogarty a 10% royalty, which was unheard of and only pertained to these superstars like Dr. Starr, to ours. And that money allowed Fogarty to go on to be named on more than 160 other patents and to start an innovation institute. The piece of the story that I always think about is that the reason that Fogarty was able to make this is not only his imagination, but the fact that he used to jump out of the window at school, because no glue in the late 50s and early 60s would make latex and vinyl adhere. It's a vinyl piece of catheter tubing. And so what Fogarty did was he tied it together with the fly fishing knots that he had learned. So I think that, there's this very kind of expansive starting point to inventing point B. This idea that nothing is wasted, that your whole life might matter, that you're moving forward without a template, and that you're trying to organize around that. And really kind of how do you do that? And then we'll look at how do you do that with regard to something like blockchain and antiquities. So just to say, just to kind of complicate and move the land that we stand on just a little bit more, I think it's hard to conceive of constantly how much the world is in a state of formation. We live in a point B world of things that we take for granted that have actually changed somewhat recently, and things that I think we would agree are all changing rapidly right now. Certainly in the arts, the move online has changed a lot. You can buy a T-Rex skeleton for $32 million, but you cannot make a cast of it because the sale comes about from a kind of blood feud between two brothers, one of whom retained the IP rights and one of whom sold the skeleton. So I'm not sure this is a positive point B world, but it, this sort of transformation, something like gay marriage, it has only recently become legal in the United States. And I think it's hard to forget it's hard to remember how recent, easy to forget how recent that is. Women in the workplace, and this is a still from the movie Working Girl, which is a masterpiece. On the one hand, the recency of progress of women in the workplace, and on the other hand, the statistics about how many women have left external outside the home employment during the pandemic, so really in flux. Similarly, the sort of recency of the point B world of taking air travel for granted, and yet then not in the last year. I think it's hard to think about the Bataclan in Paris without thinking of the terrorist attacks. And then at the same time, I don't know about you, but I find it hard to see pictures of people in enclosed spaces without masks, without wanting to make sure they're okay. And then democracy, I think is one of the point B projects that we live in, but that's deeply, deeply in flux. This is a picture from the New Yorker. I did a Google search for democracy, and this is the first image that came up. But we think of this is the United States in early 2017 during the Women's March. And I'm not going to show the insurrection from January, but this is a member of the House of Representatives in the United States who has scrapped a speech he had written after the insurrection to give a speech off the cuff, holding people accountable. It off screen, it almost came to blows. There's a member of the other party who I allegedly tried to throw a punch. I think all of us, around the world have been stunned and amazed and awed at the democracy protests in Belarus or in Russia around Alexei Navalny's return to Moscow. And I think it's pretty fair to say that we're all kind of crash test dummies in the car of democracy, that this is something that's being actively worked out right now, and that it's very easy to believe that institutions will carry on as they have because that's the point B world we live in, without recognizing this kind of artistic vulnerability that point B worlds are reinvented all the time for better or worse, and what is it really to kind of commit to that as a practice. So I really do think this as a sort of significance claim of this talk and this work is that art is a proxy for independent thinking, and that independent thinking is the greatest lever of power in any democracy. So that when we're invited to reinvent the future, the best gift that we have is our capacity as individuals to believe that we have a contribution that is ours alone to make, which we may make collectively with other people, but we make by trusting our own skepticism and creativity. And the starting point here is really what I would call lighthouse questions, which is what's the question you really mean to ask? Not the tactical solution that you wish to reach, but the question you mean to ask. And then how can you move forward toward that question? So Bannister's lighthouse question is, what is humanly possible? Is it humanly possible to run this mile under 4 minutes? You often see questions get phrased as solutions. My Twitter feed is full of people saying, cancel student debt. And I think the question behind that is, how can you make education equitable and affordable and therefore inclusive? So just this sort of shift to questions. Secondly, this kind of acceptance of how much creative work inventing point B requires being in the weeds, requires kind of a comfort with the difference between what it looks like to accomplish something great and what it feels like to do the uncertain early work of trying to get there. So I often think of the US writer Harper Lee, whose book To Kill a Mockingbird sold 40 million copies, won the Pulitzer Prize, became an Oscar-winning movie. If you look at that from an aerial view, you see all those accomplishments. She was once asked to describe her process, and she described it as wearing through 2 pairs of blue jeans, sitting in a chair at her typewriter. And I think this is an important thing to remember. Even if we talk about democracy and protests, this is sort of day in, day out work, the logistics, the arranging of travel. In this case, a picture of a subway metro station in Washington, D.C. during a protest. Sort of the human work, the invisible human work that goes into things that become important. So I want to shift and apply these ideas to blockchain and to kind of open a conversation that I think about a lot, but I haven't figured out. And so some of these questions will be speculative in the form of an invitation to all of us to stay in conversation and to see what we can reimagine, what seems fixed now in our institutional kind of ecosystem and how that might change. So I think people kind of know blockchain from the idea of Bitcoin. In the fall of 2008 and early 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto proposed Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. And I want to distinguish between Bitcoin and blockchain. So Bitcoin, the currency, has gone from like $1.04 in 2011 to about $35,000 today. That currency was invented in order to protect the sanctity of a decentralized ledger. So blockchain is a registrarial technology, and Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency invented to encourage many people to protect the sanctity of that record by solving mathematical puzzles to win currency. And it's blockchain, this sort of decentralized registry, that I really want to talk about today. The Satoshi white paper, so again, circulated in 2008, and the actual Bitcoin blockchain was launched in early 2009. It has 8 total footnotes, and 3 of the footnotes are to the work of Haber and Stornetta. One is a paper with a third author as well. Haber and Stornetta have a paper from 1991, so around the time Nicholas Sirota is sketching out the Tate Modern, and it's called How to Timestamp a Digital Document. I work at NYU with a professor, David Yermak, who's the chair of the finance department at the business school. He was reading this. He teaches a digital currencies class that I lecture in, and he noticed that the paper was had a Morristown, New Jersey address. So he, on a lark, emailed the authors, and Stornetta wrote him back, and they met at the local Friendlies. So Friendlies is like the ice cream place where you take your children on their birthday. Turns out Friendlies is also where Stornetta had the breakthrough idea for what became the prototype of the blockchain. So again, if you're thinking of inventing point B and this kind of invention of the world in ordinary circumstances, Haber and Stornetta worked together as colleagues in Belcourt, the research lab, in the late 80s. And what they noticed was that computers are really coming online. Something like 15% of US households had a desktop computer at the time. And they were troubled by how easy it was to falsify or manipulate a digital file. And they said to themselves, and this is the Lighthouse question, how will we know what was true about the past? And how can we do that without having to trust a central administrator to keep the records? So turns out this is really hard to do, like frustratingly hard for a cryptographer and a physicist, respectively. And then one day, Stornetta was at Friendlies with his family, and he said, you know, the way to do it actually is if we have so many copies of the ledger that it's impossible to change them all at once. And so that's what they built. They built this system where you could put a timestamp, and the timestamps would be linked, and therefore you couldn't change one without changing all of them. So this is a proto blockchain. It doesn't have the dynamic cryptocurrency piece to it, but as you can see from the citations in the Satoshi white paper, it was really foundational. What they did was they published an alphanumeric code in the New York Times, and then people could use that to verify the blockchain. People who had like chemistry lab experiments with notebooks where the binding is stitched and the pages are numbered so that you can't, you know, go back and tamper with your lab results. And here they could do it electronically. They were vastly ahead of their time. Haber went on to be a researcher. Stornetta became a high school math teacher. He taught the worst performing ninth graders and the best performing seniors. And they both now, again, work in the blockchain space because the technology has redeveloped. And you see a kind of whole constellation of art blockchain companies, many to watch. And I won't go into these now, but if you're curious, you can look at Startbond, which is a Japanese company. This is a slide from Taihei's, the founder's deck. Verisart, Artery, any number of these companies. But the reason I put this slide here is that if you think of blockchain as a decentralized registry, it actually can touch on every aspect of art markets and also art nonprofit infrastructure. And it starts to function as a governance system. So I have always thought this, and I know this sounds a little idealistic, that blockchain is as revolutionary a structure as democracy. It may not ever take that full form, because it may be stopped by regulation or circumstance, but it's that powerful of a tool of relating. And this really takes me to the way in which it can be used in museum restitution contexts and also in art markets. And really what it is that the registrarial nature of blockchain almost exactly overlays the consideration of provenance, the history of ownership in the arts. And when we look at provenance, you know, we often forget that their records, like this is Leo Castelli's notebook of early Jasper John sales. This is the collector, Emily Hall Tremaine's record of on an index card of early Jasper John's paintings sold to the Whitney. And this is what they look like in catalog raisonné format. But what you forget is that actually masks the fact that artworks are sets of rights, that they're not just images in a catalog raisonné or physical objects on a wall. They're ownership rights and exhibition rights and cash flows and intellectual property rights. And so I want to present just briefly this idea of blockchain and antiquities as an application of kind of how we reimagine essentially decolonial practice, collaboration, and a justice mindset that disrupts some of the largest plate tectonics of the international cultural heritage infrastructure that we all inhabit. The starting point is the story of what are called the Lisi frescoes, which were made for this chapel in Cyprus. They came to the attention of art philanthropist Dominique de Menil in the early 1980s. She was showed these in an apartment in Munich and offered them for purchase. She was also shown drawings of the frescoes in situ. These are fictional drawings. These are completely made up. She was also shown 2 reference photos. These are real. So she quickly understood that these might be treasures that had been stolen. She was worried that if she let on that she knew that, they might be destroyed. And so she acted as if she wanted to buy them, turned around and hired the former US Attorney General. Mrs. de Menil was sort of French and American, and the co-founder with her husband of the Menil collection in Houston, but had been living in Paris at the time. She located the rightful owner, which was Cyprus and the Church of Cyprus, and she entered into a very novel agreement with the Church of Cyprus, whereby Mrs. de Menil and a newly formed Byzantine Fresco Foundation purchased the works. They agreed that the Church of Cyprus was the owner, but that the Menil would have 15 years of exhibition rights to the work. So they conducted this really incredible restoration of them. They installed them in a consecrated Greek Orthodox chapel on the grounds of the Menil in Houston, Texas. And they showed them there for 15 years before they were returned to the Church of Cyprus. They couldn't be returned to the chapel in Lisi. They had been taken when that area of Cyprus was under Turkish military occupation. So there was some kind of geopolitical concern about the return, but really it would have been impossible to get them in the building because the way they had been conserved, they were put into something like the basin of a boat to secure them. So they went to a museum that was mainly accessible to kind of senior members of the Greek Orthodox Church. So take that as an example, and then take the kind of more recent 2018 publication of the Sars-Savoy report commissioned by Emmanuel Macron to look at the presence of African cultural heritage in European museums. So this is something I think it's a kind of point B world that's easy to take for granted, that more than 95% of African cultural objects reside outside of the continent of Africa, and many hundreds of thousands of them are in European museums. So you might say, well, that's just sort of the way it is. That's the point B world we all live in. But actually, there are these very complex histories of looting, of colonialism, that we can revisit, that we can consider a new point B world. And what I got interested in with blockchain was the way that blockchain, because it's a decentralized governance platform, might allow us to approach these conversations around restitution much more expansively. One way that might happen is by reconsidering all the stakeholders and also the ways in which artworks are not just the artworks. They have many forms of value and many sets of rights that are bundled together in objects of heritage. So financially, they may be kind of private art market sales or ticket revenue if something is in a museum, or tourism revenue, or a sense of community ownership. Also, these sort of social and cultural forms of value that are harder to quantify. And then ownership, there's title. There could also be fractional ownership. There could be securitization. So there's the ownership of the object, but structured derivatives around it. And then in addition, there are exhibition rights, reproduction rights, moral rights, adaptation rights. So there's actually the sort of plate tectonics start to shift or loosen a little bit. And there's a very clear legal and financial context of international treaties and kind of UNESCO guidance, where things that have come into private hands after 1970 are much harder to sell into markets. And in general, there's a complication both on the museum side and on the private market side, that there are people who are aging into perhaps wanting to donate works to museums or to sell them for heirs who cannot. because of the complicated kind of history of ownership. And then there are also museums that have quite a number of works, so many that it would be impossible for them all to be on display. So if you think of something like the Parthenon marbles, I'm not sure that this line of thought really helps very much, because this is a kind of zero-sum problem where the British Museum and the Acropolis Museum have not been able to come to terms about who owns them. That you can imagine that if the British Museum said, actually, these are owned by Greece, they could then, following from the example of Mrs. de Menil, negotiate for exhibition rights for a period of time, and they might return some cash flows associated with those exhibition rights, which would then potentially fund a future expansion of the Acropolis Museum. You can imagine this happening in a source country in Africa, like a Burkina Faso or something like that, where a group of objects are returned, some are kept for exhibition in a European museum, and then there are revenues or cash flows that are returned as well. If you have a governance infrastructure based on blockchain, there's much less of a power hierarchy that's residual from colonialism. There's much more potential for kind of egalitarian participation because the ledger itself can be decentralized. So this approach really comes about from thinking of portfolios of works that, surely you don't need all 69,000 objects in the British Museum or 70,000 objects in the Musée de Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac in Paris. And so I think that, there are these kind of ways in which the math becomes more kaleidoscopic and the negotiation process becomes more flexible and expansive. I wrote a paper on this, which I published in the International Journal of Cultural Policy with a group of authors who founded a nonprofit to try to consult on these things. And I'm happy to connect with anyone and talk about this in more detail. And I was kind of very fortunate to publish a summary of that paper in the INCAT magazine in the last few months. So I would love to share this work and talk about it more specifically in detail. I think there are a lot of kind of policy and advisory implications for, how we approach bringing people to the table, how we become aware of decolonial work as itself not homogenous, as extremely specific to each story and each situation, and what it is to invite people to reimagine together, not to find a solution to enact to someone, but to find a solution to enact with someone. And so I think of, it's certainly a shift in my own thinking from being moved by the Tennyson quotation in the floor of the atrium of the British Museum, and let thy feet millenniums hence be set in midst of knowledge, to understanding that knowledge is necessarily decentralized and collective, and that holding it physically in that place may be a consideration of the past that we need to collectively move beyond. So just to conclude, what do you do with a set of ideas that large and that speculative? I think a starting point is what Roger Bannister did, which I would call studio time. It's finding the amount of time that you can afford to lose and devoting yourself to the process of inquiry, not the outcome, that being in the weeds. So when Bannister ran the sub 4-minute mile, he was working full time in the hospital. He trained on his lunch breaks because that's the time that he could afford. So what is it to commit to the noble side project, and how to do that in community with people? So in our case with this Art and Antiquities Blockchain Consortium nonprofit group, everyone's working full time, but kind of committing to it as much as possible on the side. And I think the difficulty, but also the hopefulness, is to commit as much as you can while also courageously keeping the question as large as possible. And here, I always think of the Wright brothers and inventing flight, getting a plane off the ground. They were asked how long they thought it would take for humankind to figure out flight. And they said, oh, it won't be for another 50 years. And then they got a plane off the ground 2 years later. And I always feel like if they had focused on the outcome, they might have thought smaller and invented a glider instead. It's because they gave themselves that extra kind of runway, so to speak, no pun intended, that they were able to hold to a larger vision. So I offer these ideas as a form of solidarity and kind of collective questioning of what the world is that we want to live in art and cultural management, how we invite other people into that, and how we apply reimagination not only to the future, but to repair and bringing the past into the future, and to reimagining the network of conversations around that as well. So let me stop there, and I'll stop screen sharing and take any questions. I'm having a hard time hearing you. Hang on. I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Oops, I think she was having some issues with your audio, so hopefully she'll come back. You can hear me, right?
Oh,
okay, perfect. Well, thank
yes,
you so much. That was really inspiring. Oh, are you back, Andrea?
Yes.
Okay, I think you're perfect.
Oh, great. I can hear you.
Did you want to? You can take the floor, Andrea, if you had stuff to say.
Yeah, it's fine. No, I was just planning to say thank you, as I said already. And I was keeping an eye on the chat, and some people did comment on the sort of efficiency of blockchain being applied to museums. So there's a point here that blockchain can actually help museums and galleries with provenance and retention over a long period of time. Since data is immutable on blockchain, it builds up more trust and transparency. And yeah, there's a lot of talk around data privacy and security, and hopefully this new technology can actually help and make things a bit more safe, but also transparent. Would it be possible to sort of make the idea of blockchain a bit more accessible, to be sort of understood in the cultural field for people who may not have too much background on it, or who would think of it just in terms of cryptocurrency? So yeah, how can we make this idea a bit more accessible?
Yeah. So I can recommend a few different things to read. I read an article called Art and Blockchain in Artivate Journal. It's free online if you get a login, and I'm also happy to share it. That is a kind of overview of blockchain. I would also really recommend the book that Ruth Catlow and a number of others created called Artists Rethinking Blockchain. I think they published it around 2016. And then also Jaya Clara Brecki has a book called with Ben Vickers. It's called The White Paper, and it's an annotated version of the Satoshi White Paper. So it's this is Ben Vickers, who's the Chief Technology Officer of the Serpentine Gallery in London. And I think that's a really interesting way to engage with that original document. I also think that Jason Bailey, the blogger who writes Art Gnome, and Timothy Snyder, who writes The Gray Market for ArtNet News, are good at explaining what blockchain is. So those are some places that I would start. And then if you wanted a more technological overview, so I think that the interesting thing about blockchain is, like, what's important fundamentally is that it's a database structure that doesn't have a central administrator, because there are many copies of the record, and you can't change one record without having to change every single copy. And so that's how the security is created. But if you want to understand that, and I believe that anyone can understand things that are technically difficult, even though I cannot program blockchain, I can read textbooks. There's a textbook by Narayanan, And Bono is another author on it. So Narayanan. It's a cryptocurrencies textbook, and there's a PDF of it that you can access online. And I really recommend reading the first few chapters of it. There's also a kind of Bitcoin book by Antonopoulos from several years ago. But don't hesitate to email me, and I can send you a list of things to read. I can also send Andrea and Kelsey and Luca a list to share. I think it's the biggest thing I would say is that blockchain often gets described ostentatiously as like the wave of the future, and you're like naturally resistant to being sold a bill of goods. But I think it's actually worth getting into, really thinking about, because the governance structure of it is so potentially powerful and necessary. It's exactly the tool for something like, Facebook or Twitter, where we are the product and a large company owns our data. Blockchain is the mechanism to make that a cooperative structure where all of us own our data together. So these are the, I know they're really big questions and they sound very abstract, but I think it's important for all of us to stay with it, and also in the arts to stay with it, because if we don't address these questions, someone who does not have sensitivities to art may develop structures from outside the arts.
Yeah, you made a very good point there. And I feel that, yeah, as you mentioned in your presentation, the kind of references to political things that are happening at the moment, and how this value of transparency, but also democracy, they're very key to the whole blockchain methodology and mechanism. Thank you very much for this. Loredana is asking for some more practical examples of this, but I guess they can be read about in the books that you mentioned, or any resources.
I realize there's so much material. There's also, just when you're talking about democracy, there's also a book by Finn Bruton called Digital Cash that's about the kind of utopian or radical founding story of blockchain and these kind of crypto anarchists who wanted to develop it as an alternative governance system. Just to kind of like give a more specific example, I'm seeing a lot of these questions. There's a company called Artery that registered a Christie's sale on the blockchain. And what they did was just record who owned the work, so that, and they did it in such a way cryptographically so that Artery doesn't know who owns it, but they know that the record is true. So the provenance is always known. There are also a couple of companies like Super Rare or Autoglyphs that are selling digital work online. And it's a similar structure. It's just a registry of a sale, or Maecenas or Masterworks, where they buy a work of art, divide it into shares, record those shares on the blockchain, and then you can buy shares in a major work of art.
Thank you very much. Definitely a lot to read, and indeed, because it's such a new thing, especially in the culture field, not many of us are used to it, but it does sound like a sustainable new approach to how we manage data and how we manage connections in a more transparent way. Thank you very much. If anyone would like to add anything more.
To say, I really appreciate this conversation, because I think emerging technology, I mean, even though this has been around for a while, are usually either like scary or there's a lot of resistance to it. And this is, I don't know, it was much more inspirational to me, and not only educational, but of seeing how we can use, sometimes I think, they can be used negatively, or they can be used by those in power. And so taking advantage and really showing how it can be, bringing it back to its core and applying it to this field in a way where we have issues with a pandemic, we have a climate crisis going on. So how can we use the resources that are here in a way that will bring sustainability into the future?
Yeah, I would be so honored to share the papers and to find other ways to connect, maybe like in a reading group or something like that. Because I think if there's one idea, just following up on what you said, Kelsey, is that these are human stories. And that if there's a new technology that someone has made you think is boring or flashy or too hard to understand, those are forms of power in action. And if you take anything from my talk, it's an invitation to engage in these technologies and to approach them at a human level. Haber and Stornetta, that is a human story. Like Haber, how did you meet your wife? Oh, just two struggling mimes in Paris. They are human beings. And then my own starting point in blockchain was being in a group of social practice artists, 2012 to 2014, writing about property and resale royalties as property, and then running into a mentor at a conference who said, would you talk to someone who's starting a company that has applications in the arts? And that was a blockchain company called Bitmark that's in Taipei. And the owner of Bitmark said the reason he started a blockchain company was because he had a son and he wanted to give his son his music collection. And he realized that he could not do that because he didn't own it. He just owned licenses to it. And he wanted to own the property to the music. And this is what blockchain could become, is a property registry. So I, in whatever way I can help launch us into conversation, but be skeptical of anyone who tells you they understand blockchain 100%, because I can tell you the people who, in my experience, own it the most, understand it the most, are gracious and curious and really patient if someone sounds like a third grader describing it. And I realize I haven't gone into a detailed explanation of the technology here, but it's in the papers, and I think it's easier to read.
Yeah, thank you very much. I feel that everyone will find those resources very useful to have and to read. And we do, so when we started planning the conference back in spring last year, about March or April, we also started this sort of monthly series of meetups for the network. So people who are interested in the field that we're studying or working, and we've met every month. So we are trying to continue this in 2021. So hopefully in one of these sessions, you can either be invited or just share on your behalf for us to spread to our network. So there are definitely ways that we can keep in touch and learn more about this new technology. So thank you very much again.